This is an interview with Michael Moss, an investigative journalist known for digging into the systems behind what we eat and why it's so hard to stop. He won the Pulitzer Prize for a New York Times investigation tracing the supply chain behind a contaminated hamburger, and he's the author of Salt, Sugar, Fat, which examines how processed food companies engineer products for maximum appeal. You can read more about Michael Moss on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6degrees away. Thank you, and enjoy the interview.
What defining moment or influence in your youth led you to pursue journalism, specifically investigative reporting, and set you on a path toward hard-hitting stories?
I was a really obnoxious kid who was always asking why, why mom, why dad, why does this have to be? But I think what really sort of like set me down that hole was my high school English teacher. I went to a fairly competitive school in San Francisco called Lowell, and he also taught sort of journalism as part of this English class, and she sent us out into the field one day to do some reporting, and I came back and I wrote something up and handed it in. The next day, she comes over to me. She goes, Michael, I think you have a knack for this. And oh, by the way, there are people who actually will pay you to wander around the world learning things and writing them down. And when she said that, I was like totally hooked. Here was a job you didn't really sound like work.
Hmm. So at San Francisco State, a professor encouraged you to leave class to write for the Sierra Club, which led you to your first reporting job, and you never graduated, choosing real-world experience instead. How did that bold decision shape your career, including what you learned from taking an unconventional route into journalism?
Yeah, I was kind of too impatient to finish school. I continued to like take night classes and then I ran out. It was kind of like either I keep this job or I go back to school. And no way I was going to go back to school because I was having a lot of fun already. I was sort of willing to start at the bottom. My first newspaper had a circulation of like 4,000 readers, which is like crazy tiny out in like Wyoming, but that seemed like a good start. And I was, and I was super lucky to get editors who were fantastic teachers. Um, some of them harshly. I mean, in my very beginning, I was freelancing for a news service in San Francisco, and I was quoting a geologist, hydrogeologist who had this insanely difficult last name. It was Greek, and I kind of looked at it and I kind of tried to get it right, but she caught it. It was wrong, and it fortunately hadn't been published yet. But she reamed me out in kind of a real life way that that imparted a lesson that you'd never get sort of in an academic setting. So the vividness of learning on the job was really good for me.
So, investigative reporting often starts with a tip or hunch. Can you walk us through your process when you embark on a big investigation? For example, when an editor pointed you toward a salmonella outbreak at a Georgia peanut plant in 2008, what steps did you take to recognize that as a story worth pursuing, and how did you develop it into a full investigation?
Well, just to give you a sense of sort of how pathetic I can be in spotting a story, my first reaction when she suggested doing the story about peanuts was to walk away and not talk to her for a while because I was just back from Iraq, the war, and I was pitching her a story on US arms sales, you know, big, powerful, billions of dollars, hurting people all over the world. But, Christine kind of very calmly kind of explained to me, look, Michael, think about the base notes here in this peanut story. Think about the gravity of this. Little kids are eating these peanuts and getting sick, or in some cases dying. Their parents are giving them the peanuts, not even as junk food, but these are things that should be healthy, should make the kids strong. And these peanuts are being manufactured not in China, but right here in the good old US of A. There's no one else we can blame for this catastrophe. And then finally, they were being used by, ingredients by this $1 trillion industry called processed food, about which we really knew little. And so working for the investigative group at the New York Times, you're kind of looking for elements like that to get you excited about spending a lot of time looking, working on a story, but also, hopefully getting the readers interested in spending time reading those kinds.
What tools and techniques do you, sorry, there seems to be a sort of truck behind here. Maybe I should relocate. There was a vacuuming inside my house.
I
Sorry.
didn't even notice. So
Oh, okay. Here, sorry. Let me go. Because there was vacuuming, so I didn't want to start the interview on a. Yeah.
um, and I should maybe finish the second part of your question on the peanuts.
Okay.
Oh, if you want.
Here. All set.
Um, and then once Christine had sort of, convinced me this was like a really potentially important story. I mean, there's a few elements you kind of find in investigative reporting that I think are maybe important to sort of mention. And the first thing, and it goes back to kind of curiosity, the first thing you do as an investigative reporter is that you read everything you possibly can, not just gathering facts, but also gathering kind of the names of people who might talk to you. And you're especially reading not, other newspapers, although you want to know what other papers, media have reported because you're obliged to report something new that no one has read before, being that's kind of by definition what investigative journalism is about. Um, but but you're reading these trade publications to identify people who will talk to a trade publication, which is like a specialty thing, like, gravel and tar magazine for people who build roads, right? But you're looking for people who are maybe comfortable talking to that kind of magazine who might be more apt to talk to you. And they're like, insiders, at least somewhat familiar, with the media that they won't hang up with you right away. And I did identify such a person in the Peanut story. And I immediately went to see him. He was down in Atlanta. I just got on a plane and went to see him and spent some time at his home, winning kind of his trust in me because later he was really instrumental in sharing with me some information that really sort of shed light on what went so wrong at this factory in southern Georgia.
Mhm. So, what tools and techniques do you rely on most in investigative journalism, including FOIA requests, insider sources, and analysis of documents and data? And what strategies have proven most effective for uncovering hard to find information when dealing with secretive corporations or government agencies?
Yeah, so FOIA, lawsuits, litigation, legal settlements, all of those are fantastic because documents are kind of the bread and butter of investigative reporting. In large part because people's memories can be so faulty and untrustworthy. Um, that said, you have to be careful with documents too, because you can read them wrong, or they can be incomplete, or these days they can be fabricated wholesale. So it's for me, it's always been kind of the combination of finding insider documents that were never meant to be public, and then finding the people who wrote those documents, or at least people who know about them and understand them, and convincing them to explain, put in context, elaborate on those records. So FOIA is really big. When I came to write the book on salty fat on processed food, the junk and food industry, um, I was incredibly lucky to come across this huge trove of memos and emails and white papers and strategies. And those came, weirdly enough, from the government settlement with big tobacco back in the late 1990s, where the tobacco companies were required to release publicly millions and millions of pages of documents that no one had ever been privy to. Um, but the great thing for me was that a lot of those documents were written at a time when the single largest tobacco company was also the single largest producer of processed food. Philip Morris owned Kraft and Nabisco and General Foods. And so in all these tobacco documents were all these really juicy records relating to food, and reporters really hadn't ever looked at that
Mhm.
of material from a food perspective. And then finally, the other thing you're doing as an investing reporter, you're always sort of asking yourself, or you're asking people you're talking to, does this ever get written down? I mean, how do you guys record this information or these findings? And that will often lead you to very obscure warehouses, sources of data and information that you never knew existed before.
So when you say millions and millions of pages, how do you sort of sift through what is junk and what is valuable information?
Yeah, I would just have this crazy schedule where you know, in the morning, I was sort of doing some reporting. I was interviewing. I was doing a little bit of writing earlier in the process, just trying to sketch things out. This is working on the book. And then the afternoon and evening, I would just spend, I would just roll through these records. And fortunately for me, those documents were taken by a school in San Francisco and put on the internet in a searchable form. And again, this was targeted toward people who are interested in research big tobacco. But you could literally just like type in Lunchables and draft, and up would come like all this stuff. And so I was just like a kid in a candy store, spending hours and hours and hours just sort of combing through in a not systemic way at all. Looking for documents that, as I gained more knowledge, then I would know what I was looking for, or I would know what was significant or not.
Mhm. From reporting in Fallujah while examining the Pentagon's failure on body armor to taking on powerful food companies, how do you assess and manage the risks involved in investigative work?
Well, it's funny when you're doing the work, I mean, what you're really worried about are the risks to other people. I mean, in Iraq, to get from A to B, I would often have to catch a ride with a U.S. military convoy. And that meant sitting in a Humvee where above me to the back would be a 18-year-old kid, soldier, on a heavy machine gun swiveling around looking for threats. And one of my worst nightmares was to have that, have that gun go off and strike an innocent person by mistake, because that happened a lot in the war. You also worry about sources. I mean, I did a story about a federal meat research center that was experimenting with cows and pigs and sheep, not to make them happier and healthier, but to make them more productive in ways that were like really gross and awful for the animal. And a whistleblower came to me, and through the course of that reporting, I was just deeply worried about him, his job, his personal situation, his family. I mean, he was wanting to sacrifice his job. And ultimately, in fact, he was fired and blackballed by the industry. I mean, he was so committed to the story getting out. But that was my biggest concern, was the effect this would have on somebody who was trying to help me do the story.
Mhm. Many of your stories involve voices from inside institutions, such as whistleblowers, industry insiders, and everyday people affected by corporate practices. How do you persuade reluctant sources to talk and build trust with them? Are there memorable instances when getting someone to open up that made a difference in cracking a story?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I bring, and a lot of reporters do, to the table is just empathy. A curiosity, without judgment, and then empathy. Um, and I mentioned Lunchables because, once I got those documents on Lunchables where they were, Kraft was pitching the product to the heads of the tobacco companies, and they were getting so excited about having this new product that by all logic people shouldn't even like to eat, but they were going crazy over it. Kind of reminded them of smoking, perhaps cigarettes. But once I had those documents, I was able to call up. I did first identify and then call up the key inventor of the Lunchables and say, "Hey, Bob," his name was Bob Drain, nicest guy in the world. "Bob, I've got this memo you wrote back in blah blah blah. but I don't really understand like what was going on back then. I'd really love to like spend some time looking into this and hey, can I come see you and we could talk face to face and sort of that combination of already having something that, maybe gives them the idea that you're going to write a story anyway, and it's perhaps opportune for them to tell their side of the story, but also just kind of that empathy too of instead of going after them like, hey, can I talk about that evil thing you created that's like killed thousands of people and gotten kids hooked on junk food, instead approaching it a little more open-minded and a little non-judgmental, at least. And then then you can then you can start asking the questions,
Mhm.
which is like, don't you feel guilty? And I
Mhm.
think one of your questions you were asking me, don't these guys who invented these products, that have arguably created one of the biggest man-made health disasters of our time. I mean, don't they feel
Oh, so,
that the way that they defend themselves is by arguing, and I think this is right to some extent, which is that they invented these products in a much more innocent era,
Mhm.
the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, before our dependence on them and maybe like the marketing side of the companies went so crazy and whole hog to sort of deepen our dependence on them in a way that make them really treacherous.
Mhm. In your book, No Armor, No Peace, you reported on U.S. soldiers in Iraq dying due to inadequate body armor. What were the biggest challenges of reporting in a war zone, and what impact did the story have on Pentagon policy and troop equipment?
So, so actually, there wasn't a book. That may have been something. Somebody might have picked up one of my stories and just wrote like a quickie book, or maybe it's a chapter in someone's book. The the problem for me in Iraq was I wasn't a war reporter. I wasn't trained to go into a combat zone and find information and survive to write about it. In fact, I didn't even have any medical training. Um, I went to Iraq 18 months after the war had started. So reporters who were covering the war had already gone through kind of intense, combat kind of training situations. I took like a Red Cross course, medical course, and then I realized, that they were teaching me how to like help someone else's wound, not my own. So it's like very little training was kind of the first challenge. I really didn't know what I was doing. First time I got in a Humvee, there was a TV reporter sitting next to me, and he goes, "Hey, Michael, I think you actually have your helmet on backwards." So just ineptitude was sort of was kind of the first challenge. And then the second, this is really kind of an environment where it would be easy to sort of point at problems without sort of understanding that, in a situation like a war, shit's always going to happen. And you kind of have to measure the certain levels of awfulness and badness, and you have to have a really good sense of context. Like what could have happened? What should they have done in this situation to make things better for the in this case the soldiers. So those I think were two of the biggest challenges.
Mhm.
And besides which, being the war zone was crazy. I mean, I when I first went to Iraq and I did 4 or 5 trips, it was our bureau was outside of the protected green zone in Baghdad, and the mortars would come over our house into the U.S. military area in the Green Zone. But by the time I left, it had turned into a civil war where the mortars are flying every which way, and your chances of getting caught in sort of in a bad situation are much higher. And that's when I stopped. That's when I basically made the calculation. This line of reporting that I'm doing kind of isn't worth risking my life anymore.
So, your 2009 New York Times article traced the sordid history of a single contaminated hamburger that left a 22-year-old dance instructor paralyzed. The very next day, the USDA ordered a review of its meat safety practices in response to your findings. How did you go about piecing together that one burger's supply chain and uncovering where the food safety lapses occurred? And what was it like interviewing the victim and others who have survived such sort of things?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the victim, Stephanie Smith. I was actually pretty hard-hearted in searching for a victim, a personal lead to the story, basically looking for somebody who had the most compelling story to say. And I actually sat down with a video reporter at the Times, and we jointly interviewed, I want to say half a dozen people, or sometimes parents of a child victim, crassly looking for somebody whose story was super compelling and kind of to the point. And Stephanie, a wonderful person, sort of fit the bill. I mean, here she was. Her dream job was being a dance instructor for children, and she's not even eating meat. She gets this contamination sort of accidentally at her mom's house, where hamburgers are made for dinner, and it paralyzes her from the waist down. So she survived, but it totally wiped out her, the love of her life working as a dance instructor. So super compelling as a quick but forceful way into the story, which was not about her, of course. It was about all of these companies involved in the chain, the sourcing chain that led to that situation. Initially I was looking at outbreaks of E. coli in hamburger happening all over the country in situations where there really wasn't very much reporting. The government wasn't releasing much information. And I immediately knew that what I wanted to do is find one case and write about one hamburger, one situation, because otherwise the information could just get dry and overwhelming and the reader will get lost. The thing that really made that story was that um, while I was also looking for one case, it happens that there was also one attorney in the country who specialized in suing food companies when people got sick. His name is Bill Marler, terrific guy out in Seattle. Um, but Bill's sort of game plan was to go to companies when they were identified as the source of the problem and basically say to them, you know, I'm going to sue you, and it behooves you to settle this case as fast as you can. And as part of that, he would request from them documents, again, thousands and thousands of pages. Um, but Bill didn't really pay attention to the documents because he was just looking to sort of leverage, you know, a quick but very, valuable settlement for his client. And in this case, when I went to Bill and said, "Hey, do you have any cases involving like a really big food manufacturer, meat manufacturer?" Because that was the other element that I wanted. I didn't want like a little fly-by-night company. I wanted a big one. And I had identified Cargill as being one of the biggest meat manufacturers. You know, he told me that he had a case he hadn't even filed yet, but he had all of these documents that he was willing to sort of share with me that took me inside these very secret, private workings of Cargill as they were struggling with their own kind of internal testing systems that were showing amounts of E. coli and salmonella and other contamination in burger. And it really sort of opened the door to let me ask, that sort of big questions like, how did this happen and what's wrong with the system that would allow and permit companies to sort of operate in this will and not maximize or minimize the risk that we have eating their products. The other huge element, or what turned into a huge element for that story, was that there was a good guy. There was a good company, and it was none other than Costco, the retail chain. Um, they also were a very large manufacturer of hamburger, but they and they alone were doing the kinds of simple testing that enabled them to sharply reduce the risk to consumers. And they were willing to open up and show me their operation as it contrasted with the rest of the meat industry. So those are kind of the huge elements that I was looking for, knowing this was a big, important story. A compelling victim, you know, being able to get inside, a company in a situation that I was writing about. And then having another entity doing the right thing, because so many investigative stories will beat up on an institution or a company for doing something wrong, but they really won't take the next step and go, well, what should the company have done? What should the company had done right? And was that even possible to do the right thing? And I think that's really important, especially in this day and age, to sort of ask those additional hard questions. That's what really makes, in my mind, an investigative story both compelling but also useful for changing public policy.
So how do you go about finding half a dozen leads like Stephanie Smith and not only learning about their stories, but actually getting in contact with them and learning sort of on a more personal level what they've done?
Yeah, so again, the problem with food safety is that the government releases very little information, including the names of the victims. They're not in the public record. So again, in this case, it was super simple. I went to Bill Marler and other attorneys who brought cases. Um, he had the victims, or the victims' parents if they were kids. And it was as simple as just sort of asking him, like, could you share with me, and could you put me in touch with some of your, that's a very simple example. Other times it gets much more complicated and sort of trying to find even innocent people who may not want, have lots of reasons for not wanting to share publicly kind of their part of the story. And then it's often just a lot of legwork, a lot of picking up the phone and talking to people who might know somebody, who might know somebody, who might know somebody else. And you do a lot of what's called chaining, in looking for people.
Mhm. You've mentioned that after your meat safety investigations, a source in the food industry urged you to examine what companies were intentionally putting into our food, specifically pointing to the enormous amounts of salt, which led you to sugar and fat as well. What convinced you that the processed food industry warranted a book-length investigation rather than an article? And what insights did you gain from this experience?
Yeah, so that's crazy. I mean, the short answer is that the editor, now publisher of Random House, convinced me. So I won the Pulitzer Prize for that burger story. He reached out to me. His name's Andy Ward, a fantastic book editor, and said, "Hey, would you ever consider kind of writing a book?" And I go, "What about?" And he goes, "I don't know anything. You could write about the meat industry." And we had lunch, this Thai restaurant on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, and I sort of thought about it, I go, Andy, I don't really want to spend a couple of years reporting more on the meat industry. And frankly, I don't think people really want to read about that. But let me tell you about this other crazy thing. I just did a story for the Times on salt as this insanely sort of hyper engineered additive that companies are adding to their processed food for reasons that kind of go even beyond like taste, for industrial reasons, blah blah blah. And I just started writing a story about sugar too, which is like really wild and crazy. And I think he could sense my excitement. And then when I mentioned fat, he goes, salt, sugar, fat. That would make a nice title for a book. I mean, he's one of these editors who acts on instinct. So that was it. I mean, he got it through that conversation and convinced me. I did stop at one point though and hesitate, at least about the focus of the book, because there's some like 5,000 additives that are added to processed food, and we've heard a lot about this lately from the Maha people, who have gotten who got RFK Jr. to ban, synthetic dyes and Skittles and sugary cereals. Um, and I had that same concern when I started out, whether I should focus more broadly on these 50,000 additives or whether it was justified to focus on those three elements, salt, sugar, fat alone. And I just went to a really smart guy at MIT, doctor who studied food and ran a terrific organization that fights on behalf of consumers. And so I just sort of ran it by him and said, "Look, is this, am I on thin ice, sort of focusing on these three elements?" He said, "No, I think in terms of their overall power to affect people, you're on a right track with those."
Mhm. What do you think of RFK Jr.? Hmm.
You know, I don't really understand him. He's professing to follow the science, but he's not following the science. He's in the wrong job. If you really want to change or help people change their eating habits in this country, you don't go to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which he is in charge of. You go to the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, because that's where the government joins with the big processed food companies to make the cost of soybeans and field corn and sugar so low that it makes these products incredibly attractive. And you really want to cause change, and help people change their eating habits. That's where you would go. So he's in the wrong place. He's surrounded himself by grifters, quote unquote, who are like selling, these unscientific, silver bullet solutions to your health and wellness. And he's just not having any impact.
Mhm. So one concept you explore is the bliss point, which is the optimal amount of sugar or salt and fat that makes food irresistible. Did you encounter any individuals inside these companies who felt conflicted about creating food that contributed to obesity and disease, or any efforts where they tried to make their products healthier?
Yeah, I mean, the inventor of the bliss point, a guy named Howard Moskowitz. I mean, they all sort of have their own kind of defensive mechanism. Howard would just kind of say, who I met and spent time with, would just kind of say, "Look, I mean, I had a job, I had a family to feed. I wasn't like responsible for the overall scope of things or the impact." Um, I mentioned Bob Drain, the inventor of the Lunchables, who said, "Look, we invented the Lunchables as an occasional treat. We had no idea, you know, people were going to, start eating this every day, and or it would lead to this invasion of fast food style products into the grocery store where people didn't appreciate the hidden cost to their health of eating these products." Um, Well, and then there was the former head of Coca-Cola, Jeffrey Dunn, a former president of Coca-Cola, who, by his own sort of description, just kind of like heard a voice in the sky that said he was down in Brazil, hearing from his people in their latest strategy for getting the up and coming middle class there to get hooked on Coca-Cola. And, you know, by Dunn's recollection, this voice came out of the sky saying, "These people need a lot of things, but it's probably not a Coca-Cola." So, I mean, some of these people have not only sort of come to have misgivings about their work, but they've flipped and switched sides, and they're now making up for that by applying their know-how on creating and marketing products for things that are actually good and healthy for you. Dunn created an advertising campaign for baby carrots, of all things, um, using sort of fun and humor and entertainment to sell vegetables to kids in a way that, Coke uses those elements to sell soda.
Mhm. So I like to say sort of two things. So in terms of Lunchables, I definitely lived that experience. Not personally, I've never had a Lunchable, I don't think. Except when I was a kid, I would say probably three-fourths of the class would have Lunchables every day for lunch and arguably maybe even dinner on some days. And then there's also Logan Paul, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, is creating Lunchly, which is, I mean, he's completely just targeted towards kids, and it's a Lunchable sort of remake. But second, so I was talking to Professor Terence O'Dean from Berkeley's School of Business, and he was saying he was doing a lot of work regarding Robinhood and how they're sort of manipulating traders into overtrading and thus losing money. But he was saying as long as it's legal and as long as you can make more money via having confetti on your screen and sort of gamifying the whole thing, then people are going to continue sort of refining and creating the most addictive or most sort of optimal product they can, despite if it's affecting customers and if it's bringing them down. Do you think that a shift in what people are eating would come more from policy side or more from just the cultural ch shift in terms
I
of?
mean, the root, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the root really is our capitalist system, which is rewarding these companies and their investors. These are all publicly traded companies. If you own mutual funds, you own a piece of Lunchables, and you are partly, responsible, culpable for that company's actions. And in my mind, but that's sort of the nature of our capitalist system, which rewards profit over everything else. And, early on, I think that, in my reporting, I kind of, and when I give talks, I would usually say things like, look, I don't see this industry as this evil empire that intentionally set out to make us all sick on their products. These are companies doing what most companies want to do, which is to make their product as possible. And they do that by making their product as attractive as possible. And to do anything else is kind of outside of the capitalist system. The reason, I mentioned Costco and Hamburger taking extraordinary steps to test their ingredient meat before they mixed it together, a way of protecting consumers. The reason they do that is they have like a little socialist system going on because Costco makes a lot of its money from member fees. You pay an annual thing. And so it's beholden to the safety of its and well-being of its members in a way that no other food kind of retailer is, which is really interesting. How just that little dynamic changes things and changes the value system that a big corporation. So, so yeah, I mean, I think that I, you know, I think I think that yes, there needs to be policy change. The problem is that, you know, it's hard to get anything like that done. The closest that anybody's come to in this country is putting a tax on sugary soda and other sugary things. It's a few cities in this country, Berkeley, Philadelphia, that have done so as a way of discouraging, as a way of nudging people into buying less of that product that's harmful to them. Mexico, I think, has a whole sugar tax in the whole country. That's probably the toughest thing I think that the government's tried to do to help steer people. But one of the crazy complications with processed food, and that's one of the reasons why you haven't seen like a big legal case against the processed food industry like you have against tobacco, which is that, there's so many of these products, and it's really hard to single out any one of them for being responsible for any sort of part of this health disaster that we're in. And you can't hold up Oreo cookies and blame them for making the country sick. It's the Oreo as part of this larger, heavily processed food diet that seems to be the problem. So how do you hold these individual manufacturers responsible? It's just much more complicated than something like tobacco.
So, a lot of times, if I go to Europe or South America and things like that, there's lots of emblems on products saying excess sugar, um, excess sodium, and whatnot. And often you hear people say, "Oh, this kind of stuff wouldn't exist in the U.S. or wouldn't exist outside of the U.S." when they see excess colors and whatnot. Do you think there's a large discrepancy between what's going on in the U.S. and what's going on in Europe or other parts of the world?
Yeah, yes and no. So Europeans have become alarmed about the sort of invasion of processed food. I mean, you walk in a grocery store, and just last summer I was in grocery stores in Germany, Italy, France, and they're looking more and more like American stores with lots of heavily processed food where you open it up and you can't tell what the original food stuff was that went into this product, and also heavy with salt, sugar, fat, and heavy with convenience. So the people and the governments in Europe and other parts of the world are rightly very concerned about the growth and the spread of American style processed food. And one of the things that they've started doing in some places is sort of a traffic light system. Chile, I think, started this too. Very simple, red, yellow, green, as an indicator. um, but one of the dangers of that is this phenomena called nutritionalism, which is kind of looking at these foods from breaking down their nutritional components. And it's a danger in my mind because these companies are really good at manipulating their formulas to avoid triggering alarms among the government and or the populace. And you can kind of look back over time. And like, for example, in the 80s, sugar was a big concern. Back in the 80s, believe it or not, people were really worried about sugar. And what you found was companies reducing the sugar in their products, but then jacking up the fat and the salt in order to maintain the high allure, the yummy, irresistible sort of flavors and tastes. Um, 90s were about fats, the aughts were about salt, and you saw the same thing. And so the companies are super good about kind of positioning their ingredients and their formulas to address quote unquote kind of nutrition concerns, you know, and overlooking kind of the bigger question of, but is this stuff really good for you? Is this like really food we should be eating? It's a much harder question to quantify and put on the front of the label. You can tell people how much salt, sugar, fat there is in product, but that still doesn't tell you, is this a good product? I mean, is this something that's going to make me healthy?
That's very interesting, especially like you see protein shakes oftentimes where it's like no sugar, lots of protein, low fat and whatnot, but it's still very questionable what's inside.
Yeah, that's another thing too going on too, which that, the last 10 years, these companies have started trying to put their best foot forward and pretend to make healthier products. And so they will do things like add calcium, or they'll add a little bit of protein to sugary Cheerios and then splash the word protein on the front of the package. Or they'll add a little bit of, manufactured fiber because there's some sense that fiber can help us feel fuller faster and thus control how much we eat. But it's also really a complicated equation, and there's no evidence of what these companies are. The fiber they're adding is sort of doing that. So it's gotten harder to walk into a grocery store, well-meaning by your health, your family's health, and make really good decisions about what to buy and what to avoid
Mhm. Yeah, so
because of the games that these companies play.
And I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but just for other viewers, I remember my biology teacher used to say you should go on the outside of the grocery store, and everything on the outside is relatively good enough. The inside should be sort of more avoided.
Yeah, yeah, unless you're vegetarian, because you're going to find the meat on the outside too. But yeah, you tend to find like whole foods on the perimeter, right? The produce section with fruits and vegetables, the dairy section, right, where you're basically just getting a milk product or meat products. Yeah, it seems to make sense, and certainly, the food companies spend most of their advertising budget, marketing budget on the center of the store, the 90% where they've got their brands and their highly processed products.
Mhm. So what do you think about these sort of healthier? I mean, obviously Whole Foods is huge, except there's things like Erewhon and various health-centered luxury grocery stores in cities like New York City or LA. What do you think of those?
I mean, if people can afford them, great. I mean, the real challenge in my mind, and the reason I kind of wrote Salt, Sugar, Fat was thinking about people who live in Kansas and have to shop at Walmart. And I think that's the real That's the real challenge. I mean, look, I live in Brooklyn, New York. We have an incredible farmers market system here, but it's expensive and you're paying more um because, on the notion that's a just payment for these, it's the only way these farmers are going to survive. Or people in Berkeley, California, or Portland, Oregon have access to really good food. I'm more concerned about sort of the average American who maybe doesn't have any nutrition training, has a crazy lifestyle where they're working two jobs and can't spend their whole day thinking about like what food is good for them, and then have a budget problem amount of money to spend, and they're looking at a situation where a basket of blueberries can cost as much as a 2 pound frozen pizza with four meats and three cheeses that's going to feed the whole family. And what choice you're going to make in that situation. That comes back to Department of Agriculture really controlling the whole sort of food economics in this country. And that's a political thing going back to President Nixon, who was the first president who sort of realized elections could be won or lost on the cost of food. And he was the first one to sort of do everything he could to lower the price of these, you know, basic, processed food products, which seem cheap, but have this huge hidden cost to their convenience to our health.
So what is the solution for the average American who wants to eat healthier and avoid the four meat, two cheese pizzas?
Yeah, it kind of depends where you are in terms of thinking about food and knowing about food. Um, I mean, one of the great things, I mean, so, I wrote this other book about sort of looking at the question of addiction and whether we should think about these products as being addictive, like, heroin. And at first I thought, that's the craziest thing I ever heard, comparing Twinkies to meth. But after spending time recording the book, I came full circle. And now I'm convinced that in some ways these food products are actually even more risky for us than alcohol and tobacco, certainly. In part because they are going after our deepest instinctual biology that was designed to attract us to food. And spending time with evolutionary biologists, I sort of came to realize that we're built not just to love to eat, but to love to overeat. Because for most of our existence, putting on body fat was like a really great thing. It enabled us to get through drought and famine. So our brain and our body is designed to get us to overeat and store calories as much as we can as body fat. And it's only in the last 50 years that the sort of nature of our food supply has changed so dramatically by these companies that now overeating has become an everyday thing and body fat has become this problem. So, depending on and that said, I mean, there are some people for whom some foods are incredible triggers. Oreo cookies. And if you're somebody who can't resist not eating, half a bag of Oreo cookies in one sitting, then it probably behooves you to do everything you can to avoid ever meeting an Oreo cookie or letting in the house. Um, there are other people whose problem with overeating, and I'm not even thinking about nutrition now, is just, is that 3 o'clock craving they get for like a cookie. And then there are lessons to be drawn from the world of drug addiction that are really helpful. You can call a friend, you can walk around the block, you can, eat something else like a handful of nuts. But one of the lessons from the world of drug addiction is that those cravings come so fast and hard that you have to get ahead of them. And so if you know you're going to get a craving for cookies at 3 o'clock, you need to be doing something at 2:45 in order to ward off that craving. Because once it hits you, you have like no hope of resisting. And then there's other people whose problem with food is just kind of the loss of love and romance of cooking like a homemade meal from scratch and then sitting around with friends and family and having that. And so, you know, doing more cooking from scratch is like a really great thing. Um, and one of the things that companies have tricked us into thinking is that we need them for convenience. Um, yeah, I tell this story about this guy who invented instant pudding in the days where making pudding would take you like 3 hours of stirring, and he came up with the right chemical to make it instant. Well, it doesn't have to be that extreme. And I often talk about, my recipe for spaghetti sauce that takes me all of 90 seconds, where I start with a can of like plum tomatoes and a little olive oil and a little chopped up garlic maybe, and throw in some basil or whatever herbs I have. And granted, if it simmers for a while, it's going to be more appetizing, but cooking from scratch doesn't have to be time consuming, and it seems to have these incredible benefits in terms of making us mindful and appreciative of the food. So yeah, more cooking. So avoid the worst stuff, come up with strategies for dealing with those temporary cravings you might get during the day, and then thinking about ways of trying to cook for yourself, at least some things.
Mhm. And how do you weigh out the importance of nutrition in relation to exercise and things like that?
I've always been sort of a bit of an athlete. I used to run marathons and then ultra marathons, and I would pay, lots of attention. I would look at food as sort of empowerment, as energy, as muscle. So it's really easy when you're an athlete because you can see, very quickly when you're not eating well and how that affects your performance as an athlete. It's harder for people who don't work out. And, in that last book, I wrote about the word diet, which has been corrupted to mean like, eating these like horrible products or diet programs that really don't work. But the Greeks invented the word to mean sort of a combination of good exercise, great sleep, healthy food and quality work, employment, as being sort of all the elements that you need. And it's really true today. I mean, you can't solve, a food-related health problem without thinking about exercise and without sort of thinking about sleep as well. It's a combination of those things.
Mhm. Also, do you think the problem is necessarily within body fat, or do you think it's within nutrition?
Well, it depends what your problem is. If your problem is weight gain, that tends to sort of be body fat. You're not worried about putting on too much muscle.
Mhm.
So, and then that weight gain in turn is related to things like, heart disease and metabolic syndrome, fatty liver disease. So yeah, I think that weight gain is certainly sort of one of the big factors in making us unhealthy. But yeah, one can point to other things as well, like excess sugar as being also maybe just as bad for you, even when you don't gain weight. I mean, lean-looking people can be just as sick as obese people related to their eating habits because of what you just pointed out.
Mhm. So I was talking to, or I haven't talked to him yet, but I'm scheduling with a gastrophysicist, he's called, from Oxford. And his
Mhm.
whole idea is how eating can be one of the most incredible, joyful sensory experiences that a person can have. So do you think that you can recreate that incredible experience with eating foods that aren't necessarily destroying you? Or do you think that maybe that's not as possible for an everyday American, but eating an extra Oreo one time every week won't be the end of the world?
Mm. Yeah, I'm certainly, we're not I raised two boys, and we were never about like don't eat Oreos, but sit down and let me tell you a story about the companies making these Oreos and their marketing and their advertising and why it gets in your head the way it does. And so I was always more about sort of having a conversation with our kids rather than strictly banning stuff. I mean, we have junk food in our house because I happen to be one of those lucky people who can open up a bag of potato chips and have one handful and be satisfied and close the bag up and maybe not think about it or touch it for a week. Again, there are some people who can't do that. They can't go down the road. So it kind of depends where you are in terms of your relation to to food. So yeah, in this world, I'm looking for ways that people can shop at Walmart or Kmart and and buy food that's available there and or your average grocery store and without spending too much money and without spending too much time and eat healthily. And it's kind of difficult. I did this video. Michael Pollan, the author, if you know him, came over to my house when the book came out, Such Your Fat, and we did a video where we went shopping at my grocery store, and then we bought stuff that we thought we could turn into, a quick, healthy, cheap lunch. And I think he made like some kind of chickpea dish, and I made like pizza, and people are going, who has time to make pizza for lunch? So, it's a troubled world trying to change your eating habits with all those elements. And then there's so much else involved too, right? I mean, maybe you're somebody who cares about animals and animal welfare, and so you're going to eliminate meat. Or maybe you care about farm workers or the farmers themselves, and you're really looking for products that aren't laden with pesticides or that give the farmer or the farm worker a fair share of the profit. So there's lots of other elements involved in choosing food besides your own kind of personal health. So it can really quickly get messy and complicated. And what I often say to people who are trying to change their eating habits is to try to relax and try to change just like one thing initially and see how that goes for a few weeks or a couple months. I mean, don't expect anything overnight because these food companies have been dictating to us what we should be eating for our entire life, and our brains are wired toward that. So you're not going to get anything happening very fast. But, by changing one thing, like maybe just try to avoid sugar in drinks as your, starting playbook and just kind of see how that goes for a while without trying to do too much. Because that's where these diet programs all fail, which is they try to do too much too fast. And then when we slip, we just feel horrible about ourselves and quit altogether and go back to where we were.
So have these years in investigative reporting drastically changed how you eat and sort of what does your day-to-day eating look like?
Well, if you'd asked me a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Sierra Nevada mountains on a 2-week backpack trip with my nephew, and I was eating every day coffee for breakfast, a little bit of granola I made because it was like heavy in nuts and protein. Um, then for lunch, I would have like a tortilla with some peanut butter, and then dinner was like mashed potatoes with maybe a little kale in it. I had that every day. Um, and I lost like 15 pounds because you just can't get enough calories when you're backpacking in the high mountains. So my diet changes depending kind of what I'm doing. I'm mostly trying to subscribe to Michael Pollan's thing, which is, eat real food, right? Meaning whole foods you can identify and you kind of know what they are. Not too much, right? Look for ways to kind of control cravings and overeating. Um, and mostly vegetables for lots of different reasons. I still eat meat and I still eat some junk food but that kind of describes my eating going back even before I looked into this because of what I mentioned that I was always a bit of an amateur athlete, so was thinking about food in terms of its effects on performance.
Mhm. So a lot of times in grocery stores, things like peanuts specifically, which you have you're thinking about, and then also things like granola or even things that are marketed as healthy aren't necessarily good for you at all. So people with good intentions can leave with things that are no good for you. So do you have a rule of thumb of sort of how to navigate getting things that aren't going to affect you negatively?
Yeah, there's this new term called ultra processed food to try to describe products that are like the worst for you. And I don't really like the word because ultra to me means great. fabulous. It's like has a positive connotation. There's a cigarette called Ultras. Anyway, but that's just my own sort of thing. I think that one of the ways to level the playing field when you walk in the grocery store, because it's all stacked against you in so many ways, in part because the marketing for these products is in your head even before you walk into the store, sort of drawing you toward them. I think one of the ways to differentiate healthy from not healthy is the level of convenience. The more convenient it is to grab that food product, put it in your shopping cart, bring it home, throw it in the cabinet, and then open it and heat it, or even don't heat it and eat it. The easier it is to do that, the more convenience. It seems to me that your risk, the health risk to you from the hidden health costs, is higher. And there's obviously exceptions to that, because what's more convenient than a carrot? All you have to do is like wash it. Although, that said, one of the problems with vegetables is that they go bad really quickly in a matter of days, and that drives people on budgets crazy because it's like a waste of money. I think that's one of the things that discourages. So I'm kind of counter arguing with myself that in fact vegetables are not sort of convenient in lots of different ways. So that's how I look at the hidden dangers in grocery store products. The more convenient they are, the higher the risk there is of a hidden cost to your health, and a price to pay ultimately down the road for that convenience.
Mhm. So lastly, we ask all of our interviewees the same question, and that's how do you define success, both personally and professionally?
Ah, personally and professionally. Well, professionally is sort of easy. I mean, as a reporter, for me, the biggest reward would be getting great feedback from somebody who knew the subject I was writing about, not just your average reader who could be fooled into thinking, anything was right, and especially these days in the media, it's so difficult. Um, but um, but but having somebody or changing somebody's mind who knew a lot about this subject, was an expert in it. In fact, that to me was kind of the most, the most rewarding thing. And on a personal level, well, I also climb mountains, and one of the truisms in mountain climbing is that the success isn't getting to the top. It's like then getting yourself back down safely and alive and without hurting anybody else. Um, because that's often the hardest part of the climb, is coming down when you're tired and can easily make a misstep. Um, yeah, in my personal life, that opens up a whole lot of other things. Being a parent, being a spouse, um, waking up in the morning and feeling like I've got a plan for doing something that can help the world in a little bit. Um, Those would be my definitions of success in profession and playing and on a personal level.
Mhm. Just out of curiosity, where are you located where you're climbing mountains and whatnot?
Oh, so I'm in Brooklyn, which makes it really hard, right? So you'll find me doing lunges in my office floor and riding a bike, in the park where there's some nice hills, and running. Um, I've been climbing. Last year I went to Bolivia, to the Andes, to do some climbing there. A couple of years earlier, I went to Denali in Alaska. And I started when I was a cub reporter. I covered an expedition to Mount Everest, of all places, way back in 1983. So that's what got me an appetite for climbing and just sort of trekking at high altitude.